A housefly had been circling for the last few minutes in the bus, though the windows were closed. An odd sight here. It had been silently flying back and forth on tired wings. Janine lost track of it, then saw it light on her husband's motionless hand. The weather was cold. The fly shuddered with each gust of sandy wind that scratched against the windows. In the meagre light of the winter morning, with a great fracas of sheet metal and axles, the vehicle was rolling, pitching, and making hardly any progress. Janine looked at her husband, with wisps of greying hair growing low on a narrow forehead, a broad nose, a flabby mouth. Marcel looked like a pouting fawn. At each hollow in the pavement, she felt him jostle against her. Then his heavy torso would slump back on his widespread legs, and he would become inert again and absent, with vacant stare. Nothing about him seemed active but his thick, hairless hands, made even shorter by the flannel underwear, extending below his cuffs and covering his wrists. His hands were holding so tight to a little canvas suitcase set between his knees that they appeared not to feel the fly's halting progress. Suddenly the wind was distinctly heard to howl, and the gritty fog surrounding the bus became even thicker. The sand now struck the windows in packets, as if hurled by invisible hands. The fly shook a chilled wing, flexed its legs, and took flight. The bus slowed and seemed on the point of stopping. But the wind apparently died down, the fog lifted slightly, and the vehicle resumed speed. Gaps of light opened up in the dust-drowned landscape. 2 or 3 frail, whitened palm trees, which seemed cut out of metal, flashed into sight in the window, only to disappear the next moment. "What a country!" Marcel said. 5. The bus was full of Arabs, pretending to sleep, shrouded in their burnouses. Some had folded their legs on the seat and swayed more than the others in the car's motion. Their silence and impassivity began to weigh upon Janine. It seemed to her as if she had been travelling for days with that mute escort. Yet the bus had left only at dawn from the end of the rail line, and for 2 hours in the cold morning it had been advancing on a stony, desolate plateau, which, in the beginning at least, extended its straight lines all the way to reddish horizons. But the wind had risen and gradually swallowed up the vast expanse. From that moment on, the passengers had seen nothing more. One after another, they had ceased talking and were silently progressing in a sort of sleepless night, occasionally wiping their lips, and eyes irritated by the sand that filtered into the car. "Janine!" She gave a start at her husband's call. Once again, she thought how ridiculous that name was for someone tall and sturdy like her. Marcel wanted to know where his sample case was. With her foot, she explored the empty space under the seat and encountered an object which she decided must be it. She could not stoop over without gasping somewhat. Yet in school she had won the first prize in gymnastics and hadn't known what it was to be winded. Was that so long ago? 25 years. 25 years were nothing, for it seemed to her only yesterday when she was hesitating between an independent life and marriage, just yesterday when she was thinking anxiously of the time she might be growing old alone. She was not alone, and that law student who always wanted to be with her was now at her side. She had eventually accepted him, although he was a little shorter than she, and she didn't much like his eager, sharp laugh or his black, protruding eyes. But she liked his courage in facing up to life, which he shared with all the French of this country. She also liked his crestfallen look when events or men failed to live up to his expectations. Above all, she liked being loved, and he had showered her with attentions. By so often making her aware that she existed for him, he made her exist in reality. No, she was not alone. The bus, with many loud honks, was ploughing its way through invisible obstacles. Inside the car, however, no one stirred. Janine suddenly felt someone staring at her and turned toward the seat across the aisle. He was not an Arab, and she was surprised not to have noticed him from the beginning. He was wearing the uniform of the French regiments of the Sahara and an unbleached linen cap above his tanned face, long and pointed like a jackal's. His grey eyes were examining her with a sort of glum disapproval in a fixed stare. She suddenly blushed and turned back to her husband, who was still looking straight ahead in the fog and wind. She snuggled down in her coat. But she could still see the French soldier, long and thin, so thin in his fitted tunic that he seemed constructed of a dry, friable material, a mixture of sand and bone. Then it was that she saw the thin hands and burned faces of the Arabs in front of her, and noticed that they seemed to have plenty of room, despite their ample garments, on the seat where she and her husband felt wedged in. She pulled her coat around her knees, yet she wasn't so fat. Tall and well-rounded, rather, plump and still desirable, as she was well aware when men looked at her, with her rather childish face, her bright, naive eyes, contrasting with this big body she knew to be warm and inviting. No, nothing had happened as she had expected. When Marcel had wanted to take her along on his trip, she had protested. For some time he had been thinking of this trip. Since the end of the war, to be precise, when business had returned to normal. Before the war, the small dry goods business he had taken over from his parents on giving up his study of law had provided a fairly good living. On the coast, the years of youth can be happy ones. But he didn't much like physical effort, and very soon had given up taking her to the beaches. The little car took them out of town solely for the Sunday afternoon ride. The rest of the time he preferred his shop full of multicoloured piece goods shaded by the arcades of this half-native, half-European quarter. Above the shop they lived in 3 rooms furnished with Arab hangings and furniture from the Galerie Barbès. They had not had children. The years had passed in the semi-darkness behind the half-closed shutters. Summer, the beaches, excursions, the mere sight of the sky were things of the past. Nothing seemed to interest Marcel but business. She felt she had discovered his true passion to be money, and without really knowing why, she didn't like that. After all, it was to her advantage. Far from being miserly, he was generous, especially where she was concerned. "If something happened to me," he used to say, "you'd be provided for." And in fact, it is essential to provide for one's needs. But for all the rest, for what is not the most elementary need, how to provide. This is what she felt vaguely, at infrequent intervals. Meanwhile, she helped Marcel keep his books and occasionally substituted for him in the shop. Summer was always the hardest, when the heat stifled even the sweet sensation of boredom. Suddenly, in summer as it happened, the war, Marcel called up, then rejected on grounds of health, the scarcity of piece goods, business at a standstill, the streets empty and hot. If something happened now, she would no longer be provided for. This is why, as soon as piece goods came back on the market, Marcel had thought of covering the villages of the upper plateaus and of the south himself in order to do without a middleman and sell directly to the Arab merchants. He had wanted to take her along. She knew that travel was difficult, she had trouble breathing, and she would have preferred staying at home. But he was obstinate, and she had accepted because it would have taken too much energy to refuse. Here they were, and truly, nothing was like what she had imagined. She had feared the heat, the swarms of flies, the filthy hotels reeking of aniseed. She had not thought of the cold, of the biting wind, of these semi-polar plateaus cluttered with moraines. She had dreamed, too, of palm trees and soft sand. Now she saw that the desert was not that at all, but merely stone, stone everywhere, in the sky full of nothing but stone dust, rasping and cold, as on the ground, where nothing grew among the stones except dry grasses. The bus stopped abruptly. The driver shouted a few words in that language she had heard all her life without ever understanding it. "What's the matter?" Marcel asked. The driver, in French this time, said that the sand must have clogged the carburetor, And again Marcel cursed this country. The driver laughed hilariously and asserted that it was nothing, that he would clean the carburetor and they'd be off again. He opened the door and the cold wind blew into the bus, lashing their faces with a myriad grains of sand. All the Arabs silently plunged their noses into their burnouses and huddled up. "Shut the door!" Marcel shouted. The driver laughed as he came back to the door. Without hurrying, he took some tools from under the dashboard, then, tiny in the fog, again disappeared ahead without closing the door. Marcel sighed. "You may be sure he's never seen a motor in his life." "Oh, be quiet," said Janine. Suddenly she gave a start. On the shoulder of the road close to the bus, draped forms were standing still. Under the burnouse's hood and behind a rampart of veils, only their eyes were visible. Mute, come from nowhere, they were staring at the travellers. "Shepherds," Marcel said. Inside the car there was total silence. All the passengers, heads lowered, seemed to be listening to the voice of the wind loosed across these endless plateaus. Janine was all of a sudden struck by the almost complete absence of luggage. At the end of the railroad line, the driver had hoisted their trunk and a few bundles onto the roof. In the racks inside, the bus could be seen nothing but gnarled sticks and shopping baskets. All these people of the South apparently were travelling empty-handed. But the driver was coming back, still brisk. His eyes alone were laughing above the veils with which he too had masked his face. He announced that they would soon be under way. He closed the door. The wind became silent, and the rain of sand on the windows could be heard better. The motor coughed and died. After having been urged at great length by the starter, it finally sparked, and the driver raced it by pressing on the gas. With a big hiccough, the bus started off. From the ragged clump of shepherds, still motionless, a hand rose and then faded into the fog behind them. Almost at once the vehicle began to bounce on the road, which had become worse. Shaken up, the Arabs constantly swayed. Nonetheless, Janine was feeling overcome with sleep when there suddenly appeared in front of her a little yellow box filled with lozenges. The jackal soldier was smiling at her. She hesitated, took one, and thanked him. The jackal pocketed the box and simultaneously swallowed his smile. Now he was staring at the road, straight in front of him. Janine turned toward Marcel and saw only the solid back of his neck. Through the window, he was watching the denser fog rising from the crumbly embankment. They had been travelling for hours, and fatigue had extinguished all life in the car when shouts burst forth outside. Children wearing burnouses, whirling like tops, leaping, clapping their hands, were running around the bus. It was now going down a long street lined with low houses. They were entering the oasis. The wind was still blowing, but the walls intercepted the grains of sand which had previously cut off the light. Yet the sky was still cloudy. Amidst shouts, in a great screeching of brakes, the bus stopped in front of the adobe arcades of a hotel with dirty windows. Janine got out and, once on the pavement, staggered. Above the houses she could see a slim, yellow minaret. On her left rose the first palm trees of the oasis, and she would have liked to go toward them. But although it was close to noon, the cold was bitter. The wind made her shiver. She turned toward Marcel and saw the soldier coming toward her. She was expecting him to smile or salute. He passed without looking at her and disappeared. Marcel was busy getting down the trunk of piece goods, a black footlocker perched on the bus's roof. It would not be easy. The driver was the only one to take care of the luggage, and he had already stopped, standing on the roof, to hold forth to the circle of burnouses gathered around the bus. Janine, surrounded with faces that seemed cut out of bone and leather, besieged by guttural shouts, suddenly became aware of her fatigue. "I'm going in," she said to Marcel, who was shouting impatiently at the driver. She entered the hotel. The manager, A thin, laconic Frenchman came to meet her. He led her to a second-floor balcony overlooking the street and into a room which seemed to have but an iron bed, a white enamelled chair, an uncurtained wardrobe, and, behind a rush screen, a wash-basin covered with fine sand dust. When the manager had closed the door, Janine felt the cold coming from the bare, whitewashed walls. She didn't know where to put her bag, where to put herself. She had either to lie down or to remain standing, and to shiver in either case. She remained standing, holding her bag and staring at a sort of window slit that opened onto the sky near the ceiling. She was waiting, but she didn't know for what. She was aware only of her solitude and of the penetrating cold and of a greater weight in the region of her heart. She was in fact dreaming, almost deaf to the sounds rising from the street, along with Marcel's vocal outbursts, more aware on the other hand of that sound of a river coming from the window slit and caused by the wind in the palm trees, so close now, it seemed to her. Then the wind seemed to increase, and the gentle ripple of waters became a hissing of waves. She imagined, beyond the walls, a sea of erect, flexible palm trees unfurling in the storm. Nothing was like what she had expected, but those invisible waves refreshed her tired eyes. She was standing heavy, with dangling arms, slightly stooped as the cold climbed her thick legs. She was dreaming of the erect and flexible palm trees and of the girl she had once been. After having washed, they went down to the dining room. On the bare walls had been painted camels and palm trees drowned in a sticky background of pink and lavender. The arcaded windows let in a meagre light. Marcel questioned the hotel manager about the merchants. Then an elderly Arab, wearing a military decoration on his tunic, served them. Marcel, preoccupied, tore his bread into little pieces. He kept his wife from drinking water. "It hasn't been boiled. Take wine." She didn't like that, for wine made her sleepy. Besides, there was pork on the menu. They don't eat it because of the Quran. But the Quran didn't know that well-done pork doesn't cause illness. We French know how to cook. What are you thinking about? Janine was not thinking of anything, or perhaps of that victory of the cooks over the prophets. But she had to hurry. They were to leave the next morning for still farther south. That afternoon they had to see all the important merchants. Marcel urged the elderly Arab to hurry the coffee. He nodded without smiling and pattered out. "Slowly in the morning, not too fast in the afternoon," Marcel said, laughing. Yet eventually the coffee came. They barely took time to swallow it and went out into the dusty, cold street. Marcel called a young Arab to help him carry the trunk, but as a matter of principle quibbled about the payment. His opinion, which he once more expressed to Janine, was in fact based on the vague principle that they always asked for twice as much in the hope of settling for a quarter of the amount. Janine, ill at ease, followed the two trunk-bearers. She had put on a wool dress under her heavy coat and would have liked to take up less space. The pork, although well done, and the small quantity of wine she had drunk also bothered her somewhat. They walked along a diminutive public garden planted with dusty trees. They encountered Arabs who stepped out of their way without seeming to see them, wrapping themselves in their burnouses. Even when they were wearing rags, she felt they had a look of dignity unknown to the Arabs of her town. Janine followed the trunk, which made a way for her through the crowd. They went through the gate in an earthen rampart and emerged on a little square planted with the same mineral trees and bordered on the far side, where it was widest, with arcades and shops. But they stopped on the square itself in front of a small construction shaped like an artillery shell and painted chalky blue. Inside, in the single room lighted solely by the entrance, an old Arab with white moustaches stood behind a shiny plank. He was serving tea, raising and lowering the teapot over 3 tiny multicoloured glasses. Before they could make out anything else in the darkness, The cool scent of mint tea greeted Marcel and Janine at the door. Marcel had barely crossed the threshold and dodged the garlands of pewter teapots, cups and trays, and the postcard displays when he was up against the counter. Janine stayed at the door. She stepped a little aside so as not to cut off the light. At that moment she perceived in the darkness behind the old merchant 2 Arabs smiling at them, seated on the bulging sacks that filled the back of the shop. Red and black rugs and embroidered scarves hung on the walls. The floor was cluttered with sacks and little boxes filled with aromatic seeds. On the counter, beside a sparkling pair of brass scales and an old yardstick with figures effaced, stood a row of loaves of sugar. One of them had been unwrapped from its coarse blue paper and cut into on top. The smell of wool and spices in the room became apparent behind the scent of tea when the old merchant set down the teapot and said good day. Marcel talked rapidly in the low voice he assumed when talking business. Then he opened the trunk, exhibited the wools and silks, pushed back the scale and yardstick to spread out his merchandise in front of the old merchant. He got excited, raised his voice, laughed nervously, like a woman who wants to make an impression and is not sure of herself. Now, with hands spread wide, he was going through the gestures of selling and buying. The old man shook his head, passed the tea tray to the 2 Arabs behind him, and said just a few words that seemed to discourage Marcel. He picked up his goods, piled them back into the trunk, then wiped an imaginary sweat from his forehead. He called the little porter, and they started off toward the arcades. In the first shop, although the merchant began by exhibiting the same Olympian manner, they were a little luckier. "They think they're God Almighty," Marcel said, "but they're in business too. Life is hard for everyone." Janine followed without answering. The wind had almost ceased. The sky was clearing in spots. A cold, harsh light came from the deep holes that opened up in the thickness of the clouds. They had now left the square. They were walking in narrow streets along earthen walls over which hung rotted December roses, or, from time to time, a pomegranate, dried and wormy. An odour of dust and coffee, the smoke of a wood fire, the smell of stone and of sheep permeated this quarter. The shops, hollowed out of the walls, were far from one another. Janine felt her feet getting heavier, but her husband was gradually becoming more cheerful. He was beginning to sell and was feeling more kindly. He called Janine baby. The trip would not be wasted. "Of course," Janine said mechanically. "It's better to deal directly with them." They came back by another street toward the centre. It was late in the afternoon. The sky was now almost completely clear. They stopped in the square. Marcel rubbed his hands and looked affectionately at the trunk in front of them. "Look," said Janine. From the other end of the square was coming a tall Arab, thin, vigorous, wearing a sky-blue burnous, soft brown boots and gloves, and bearing his bronzed aquiline face loftily. Nothing but the cheche that he was wearing, swathed as a turban, distinguished him from those French officers in charge of native affairs whom Janine had occasionally admired. He was advancing steadily toward them, but seemed to be looking beyond their group as he slowly removed the glove from one hand. "Well," said Marcel, as he shrugged his shoulders, "there's one who thinks he's a general." Yes, all of them here had that look of pride, but this one really was going too far. Although they were surrounded by the empty space of the square, he was walking straight toward the trunk, without seeing it, without seeing them. Then the distance separating them decreased rapidly, and the Arab was upon them when Marcel suddenly seized the handle of the footlocker and pulled it out of the way. The Arab passed without seeming to notice anything and headed with the same regular step toward the ramparts. Janine looked at her husband. He had his crestfallen look. "They think they can get away with anything now," he said. Janine did not reply. She loathed that Arab's stupid arrogance and suddenly felt unhappy. She wanted to leave and thought of her little apartment. The idea of going back to the hotel, to that icy room, discouraged her. It suddenly occurred to her that the manager had advised her to climb up to the terrace around the fort to see the desert. She said this to Marcel and that he could leave the trunk at the hotel. But he was tired and wanted to sleep a little before dinner. "Please," said Janine. He looked at her, suddenly attentive. "Of course, my dear," he said. She waited for him in the street in front of the hotel. The white-robed crowd was becoming larger and larger. Not a single woman could be seen, and it seemed to Janine that she had never seen so many men. Yet none of them looked at her. Some of them, without appearing to see her, slowly turned toward her that thin, tanned face that made them all look alike to her, the face of the French soldier in the bus, and that of the gloved Arab, a face both shrewd and proud. They turned that face toward the foreign woman. They didn't see her. And then, light and silent, they walked around her as she stood there with swelling ankles, and her discomfort, her need of getting away, increased. Why did I come? But already Marcel was coming back. When they climbed the stairs to the fort, it was 5 o'clock. The wind had died down altogether. The sky, completely clear, was now periwinkle blue. The cold, now drier, made their cheeks smart. Halfway up the stairs, an old Arab, stretched out against the wall, asked them if they wanted a guide, but didn't budge, as if he had been sure of their refusal in advance. The stairs were long and steep, despite several landings of packed earth. As they climbed, the space widened, and they rose into an ever broader light, cold and dry, in which every sound from the oasis reached them pure and distinct. The bright air seemed to vibrate around them, with the vibration increasing in length as they advanced, as if their progress struck from the crystal of light a sound wave that kept spreading out. And as soon as they reached the terrace, and their gaze was lost in the vast horizon beyond the palm grove, it seemed to Janine that the whole sky rang with a single short and piercing note, whose echoes gradually filled the space above her, then suddenly died and left her silently facing the limitless expanse. From east to west, in fact, her gaze swept slowly, without encountering a single obstacle, along a perfect curve. Beneath her, the blue and white terraces of the Arab town overlapped one another, splattered with the dark red spots of peppers drying in the sun. Not a soul could be seen, but from the inner courts, together with the aroma of roasting coffee, there rose laughing voices or incomprehensible stamping of feet. Farther off, the palm grove, divided into uneven squares by clay walls, rustled its upper foliage in a wind that could not be felt up on the terrace. Still farther off, and all the way to the horizon, extended the ochre and grey realm of stones, in which no life was visible. At some distance from the oasis, however, near the wadi that bordered the palm grove on the west, could be seen broad black tents. All around them a flock of motionless dromedaries, tiny at that distance, formed against the grey ground the black signs of a strange handwriting, the meaning of which had to be deciphered. Above the desert, the silence was as vast as the space. Janine, leaning her whole body against the parapet, was speechless, unable to tear herself away from the void opening before her. Beside her, Marcel was getting restless. He was cold. He wanted to go back down. What was there to see here, after all? But she could not take her gaze from the horizon. Over yonder, still farther south, at that point where sky and earth met in a pure line. Over yonder, it suddenly seemed there was awaiting her something of which, though it had always been lacking, she had never been aware until now. In the advancing afternoon, the light relaxed and softened. It was passing from the crystalline to the liquid. Simultaneously, in the heart of a woman, brought there by pure chance, a knot tightened by the years, habit and boredom, was slowly loosening. She was looking at the nomads' encampment. She had not even seen the men living in it. Nothing was stirring among the black tents, and yet she could think only of them whose existence she had barely known until this day. Homeless, cut off from the world, they were a handful wandering over the vast territory she could see, which, however, was but a paltry part of an even greater expanse whose dizzying course stopped only thousands of miles farther south, where the first river finally waters the forest. Since the beginning of time, on the dry earth of this limitless land scraped to the bone, a few men had been ceaselessly trudging, possessing nothing but serving no one, poverty-stricken but free lords of a strange kingdom. Janine did not know why this thought filled her with such a sweet, vast melancholy that it closed her eyes. She knew that this kingdom had been eternally promised her, and yet that it would never be hers, never again, except in this fleeting moment perhaps, when she opened her eyes again on the suddenly motionless sky and on its waves of steady light, while the voices rising from the Arab town suddenly fell silent. It seemed to her that the world's course had just stopped, and that, from that moment on, no one would ever age any more, or die. Everywhere, henceforth, life was suspended, except in her heart, where, at the same moment, someone was weeping with affliction and wonder. But the light began to move. The sun, clear and devoid of warmth, went down toward the west, which became slightly pink, while a grey wave took shape in the east, ready to roll slowly over the vast expanse. A first dog barked, and its distant bark rose in the now even colder air. Janine noticed that her teeth were chattering. "We are catching our death of cold," Marcel said. "You're a fool. Let's go back." But he took her hand awkwardly. Docile now, she turned away from the parapet and followed him. Without moving, the old Arab on the stairs watched them go down toward the town. She walked along without seeing anyone, bent under a tremendous and sudden fatigue, dragging her body, whose weight now seemed to her unbearable. Her exaltation had left her. Now she felt too tall, too thick, too white too for this world she had just entered. A child, the girl, the dry man, the furtive jackal were the only 26 creatures who could silently walk that earth. What would she do there henceforth except to drag herself toward sleep, toward death? She dragged herself, in fact, toward the restaurant with her husband suddenly taciturn, unless he was telling how tired he was, while she was struggling weakly against a cold, aware of a fever rising within her. Then she dragged herself toward her bed, where Marcel came to join her and put the light out at once, without asking anything of her. The room was frigid. Janine felt the cold creeping up while the fever was increasing. She breathed with difficulty. Her blood pumped without warming her. A sort of fear grew within her. She turned over, and the old iron bedstead groaned under her weight. No, she didn't want to fall ill. Her husband was already asleep. She too had to sleep. It was essential. The muffled sounds of the town reached her through the window slit. With a nasal twang old phonographs in the Moorish cafes ground out tunes she recognized vaguely. They reached her borne on the sound of a slow-moving crowd. She must sleep. But she was counting black tents. Behind her eyelids, motionless camels were grazing. Immense solitudes were whirling. Seven within her. Yes, why had she come? She fell asleep on that question. She awoke a little later. The silence around her was absolute. But on the edges of town, horse dogs were howling in the soundless night. Janine shivered. She turned over, felt her husband's hard shoulder against hers, and suddenly, half asleep, huddled against him. She was drifting on the surface of sleep without sinking in, and she clung to that shoulder with unconscious eagerness as her safest haven. She was talking, but no sound issued from her mouth. She was talking, but she herself hardly heard what she was saying. She could feel only Marcel's warmth. For more than 20 years every night thus, in his warmth, just the two of them, even when ill, even when travelling, as at present. Besides, What would she have done alone at home? No child. Wasn't that what she lacked? She didn't know. She simply followed Marcel, pleased to know that someone needed her. The only joy he gave her was the knowledge that she was necessary. Probably he didn't love her. Love, even when filled with hate, doesn't have that sullen face. But what is his face like? They made love in the dark by feel, without seeing each other. Is there another love than that of darkness, a love that would cry aloud in daylight? She didn't know, but she did know that Marcel needed her, and that she needed that need, that she lived on it night and day, at night especially, every night when he didn't want to be alone, or to age or die, with that set expression amid which she occasionally recognized on other men's faces, the only common expression of those madmen, hiding under an appearance of wisdom until the madness seizes them and hurls them desperately toward a woman's body to bury in it, without desire, everything terrifying that solitude and night reveals to them. Marcel stirred as if to move away from her. No, he didn't love her. He was merely afraid of what was not she, and she and he should long ago have separated and slept alone until the end. But who can always sleep alone? Some men do, cut off from others by a vocation or misfortune, who go to bed every night in the same bed as death. Marcel never could do so. He, above all, a weak and disarmed child, always frightened by suffering, her own child indeed, who needed her, and who, just at that moment, let out a sort of whimper. She cuddled a little closer and put her hand on his chest. And to herself she called him with the little love name she had once given him, which they still used from time to time, without even thinking of what they were saying. She called him with all her heart. After all, she too needed him, his strength, his little eccentricities, and she too was afraid of death. If I could overcome that fear, I'd be happy. Immediately, a nameless anguish seized her. She drew back from Marcel. No, she was overcoming nothing. She was not happy. She was going to die, in truth, without having been liberated. Her heart pained her. She was stifling under a huge weight that she suddenly discovered she had been dragging around for 20 years. Now she was struggling under it with all her strength. She wanted to be liberated, even if Marcel, even if the others, never were. Fully awake, she sat up in bed and listened to a call that seemed very close. But from the edges of night, the exhausted and yet indefatigable voices of the dogs of the oasis were all that reached her ears. A slight wind had risen, and she heard its light waters flow in the palm grove. It came from the south, where desert and night mingled now under the again unchanging sky, where life stopped, where no one would ever age or die any more. Then the waters of the wind dried up, and she was not even sure of having heard anything except a mute call that she could, after all, silence or notice. But never again would she know its meaning unless she responded to it at once. At once. Yes, that much was certain at least. She got up gently and stood motionless beside the bed, listening to her husband's breathing. Marcel was asleep. The next moment, the bed's warmth left her, and the cold gripped her. She dressed slowly, feeling for her clothes in the faint light coming through the blinds from the street lamps. Her shoes in her hand, she reached the door. She waited a moment more in the darkness, then gently opened the door. The knob squeaked, and she stood still. Her heart was beating madly. She listened with her body tense and, reassured by the silence, turned her hand a little more. The knob's turning seemed to her interminable. At last she opened the door, slipped outside, and closed the door with the same stealth. Then, with her cheek against the wood, she waited. After a moment she made out, in the distance, Marcel's breathing. She faced about, felt the icy night air against her cheek, and ran the length of the balcony. The outer door was closed. While she was slipping the bolt, the night watchman appeared at the top of the stairs. his face blurred with sleep, and spoke to her in Arabic. "I'll be back," said Janine as she stepped out into the night. Garlands of stars hung down from the black sky over the palm trees and houses. She ran along the short avenue, now empty, that led to the fort. The cold, no longer having to struggle against the sun, had invaded the night. The icy air burned her lungs. But she ran, half-blind, in the darkness. At the top of the avenue, however, lights appeared, then descended toward her zigzagging. She stopped, caught the whir of turning sprockets, and behind the enlarging lights soon saw vast burnooses surmounting fragile bicycle wheels. The burnooses flapped against her. Then 3 red lights sprang out of the black behind her and disappeared at once. She continued running toward the fort. Halfway up the stairs, the air burned her lungs with such cutting effect that she wanted to stop. A final burst of energy hurled her despite herself onto the terrace against the parapet, which was now pressing her belly. She was panting and everything was hazy before her eyes. Her running had not warmed her, and she was still trembling all over. But the cold air she was gulping down soon flowed evenly inside her, and a spark of warmth began to glow amidst her shivers. Her eyes opened at last on the expanse of night. Not a breath, not a sound, except at intervals, the muffled crackling of stones that the cold was reducing to sand, disturbed the solitude and silence surrounding Janine. After a moment, however, it seemed to her that the sky above her was moving in a sort of slow gyration. In the vast reaches of the dry, cold night, thousands of stars were constantly appearing, and their sparkling icicles, loosened at once, began to slip gradually toward the horizon. Janine could not tear herself away from contemplating those drifting flares. She was turning with them, and the apparently stationary progress little by little identified her with the core of her being, where cold and desire were now vying with each other. Before her the stars were falling one by one and being snuffed out among the stones of the desert, and each time Janine opened a little more to the night. Breathing deeply, she forgot the cold, the dead weight of others, the craziness or stuffiness of life, the long anguish of living and dying. After so many years of mad, aimless fleeing from fear, she had come to a stop at last. At the same time, she seemed to recover her roots, and the sap again rose in her body, which had ceased trembling. Her whole belly pressed against the parapet as she strained toward the moving sky. She was merely waiting for her fluttering heart to calm down and establish silence within her. The last stars of the constellations dropped their clusters a little lower on the desert horizon and became still. Then, with unbearable gentleness, the water of night began to fill Janine, drowned the cold, rose gradually from the hidden core of her being, and overflowed in wave after wave, rising up even to her mouth full of moans. The next moment, the whole sky stretched out over her, fallen on her back on the cold earth. When Janine returned to the room with the same precautions, Marcel was not awake. But he whimpered as she got back in bed and a few seconds later sat up suddenly. He spoke, and she didn't understand what he was saying. He got up, turned on the light, which blinded her. He staggered toward the wash basin and drank a long draught from the bottle of mineral water. He was about to slip between the sheets when, one knee on the bed, he looked at her without understanding. She was weeping copiously, unable to restrain herself. "It's nothing, dear," she said. "It's nothing."